like 10 minutes max. Great. So you can just look up at the screen for a minute if you don't have it. So I titled this page. Of course, we mathematicians have even more ways of talking about the same thing. We got to give another name to the same crap you already know how to do. And it is called function notation. Okay? So this is a little page out of an activity, a Desmos activity, where you draw a graph where basically this guy, they call him Rocket Man, and he got launched out of a rocket, and then he like parachutes down. And this is a graph of his path, his trajectory that he took. And so you guys know that time is pretty much always going to be your independent variable, and that whatever the other variable is going to be the dependent variable, right? Because time doesn't freeze, doesn't stop for anything, no matter what. So that's pretty much always going to be your independent variable. So what a normal person would probably just say are the words, after being in the air for 6.07 seconds, Cannon Man is 9.675 feet off the ground. That's what a normal person would say. Here is what a mathematician would say. So this is where you do want to write, you're going to write just a little short something right here. And I don't know why I just said a normal person, because mathematicians, we're people too. Okay, but so this is how a mathematician would write this exact same thing. It's kind of like a shortcut. So they would write F with an X in parentheses equals Y. And this is this is why I always talk to you guys about this ahead of time, because your background knowledge for this particular topic works against you. Because what are you used to seeing two things sitting next to each other? And you would think that that means multiplication. And that is the biggest bone that I have to pick with function notation, because it's unnecessarily confusing, in my opinion. Because you guys have been trained to believe that that means multiplication. It does not, okay? This is a method of saying y, so the height is a function of time, is what it means. That's just another way of saying his height depends on his time in the air. That is literally how it's said. And so you'll see frequently something written like this. So instead of the F or the X in parentheses, what number in this situation represents my X? That's 6.067, right? So it'll look like this in function notation. Instead of the X, it'll be an F with that 6.07 in parentheses, and it'll be equal to 9.675. So instead of writing the X, you replace it with the X variable, and instead of the Y, you replace it with the number that represents the Y. So if you were to say this function notation out loud, what it means is his height depends on how long he's in the air, is basically what it means. Or his height is a function of time. It means his height depends on his time. It's just another way of saying the same crap. So this, friends, is something called function notation. So if you don't get anything else out of today, it's that what you thought was multiplication is not multiplication in this context, okay? It literally just means replace the X. It's just telling you the name of this function is F. And to make it even more confusing, you would think, so why do you think we probably use the letter F a lot of the time? What word does it probably stand for? Function, right, because we're talking about a function. We don't always use the letter F for function, as if we can't be confusing enough. Sometimes, and this is where I scroll down here, sometimes just to make it more confusing, smiley face, we don't necessarily use the letter F, because in the context of this situation, we're talking about height, okay? So sometimes instead of using the letter X, they'll use a letter that corresponds to the situation. So you might see this situation written like this. Instead of F of X, it'll say H of 6.67 because this particular situation involves height. So you will not always see function notation with just the letter F. You could literally see it for any number under the sun, okay? Because sometimes instead of using an F, which that has a tendency to be the generic form we use, but we also use other letters. If it happens to be talking about like some other variable, that letter could really be anything. So just to make it more confusing, here you go. Now, I know what you guys are most concerned about probably is what kind of problems am I going to, oh, yes, Dia.
My question would...
Ooh, great question. Instead of like something where you actually have to multiply, that's a wonderful question, and hold that thought because it involves the way the directions are written, which I think will become clear because that's an excellent question. So let's look at two examples of problems. First of all, anybody not okay if I scroll down? So here are the two problems that you would do. Two examples of problems that are on the Delta Math assignment that goes with this. So literally what it says, so Ren, this might help you. It's going to say a word like find the value of or evaluate instead of solve. Like if it said solve, then you would assume it's solving an equation. But if it says find the value or evaluate, which is another way of saying the word value, then you know it's asking for function notation. The good news is, even though it's written confusingly, the actual work is not much of a challenge, in my opinion. I used to like doing function notation because it looks harder than it is. It used to make me feel smart, but I was like, somebody glanced, it looks like my homework's hard. Because this is literally all you're going to do on that Delta Math, guys. So this just basically means, hey, when x is -7, what is y going to be equal to? So you go over to -7 on the x-axis. Oh, that's a +7. I was just making sure you were paying attention. So you go over to -7 on the x-axis, and you look above to see what is the y value that goes along with -7. So what number would you type in there?
3.
You would type 3. It's basically just saying, hey, what's the y coordinate? Is what it's asking. At one point on the graph, if the graph is at -7 along the x-axis, what is the y coordinate to go with it? So you would literally type in that answer box in Delta Math, you would just type the number 3. Would be all that you would do. So it looks complicated, but the actual work behind it really isn't too bad. Okay, so let's look at another example that's very similar. So this time, instead of looking at -7, what is it telling me that I'm looking for? -6 on the x-axis. I didn't mean for them both to be negative, but it works the same whether it's positive or not. So I would go over to -6 on the x-axis and look to see at what point, what is the y coordinate that goes along with it. So what is the y coordinate that's right there above the -6? That is a 6, exactly. So you'll literally just type the number 6 into that Delta Math problem, okay? Any questions about what you would do with a graph? Nope. All right, so turn the page real quick. And actually, you know what? I think I'm actually going to stop with this one because I promised I wanted you guys to have about an hour. So here's what we're going to do. So on the Delta Math, there are